Welcome to the first annual Center for a New American Security public debate featuring the nation's best collegiate debate program. Last November, Iran and the so-called P5+1, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, plus Germany, negotiated an interim nuclear accord that basically froze Iran's nuclear program in place to enable additional diplomatic talks to reach a long-term, enduring, comprehensive solution. The agreement went into effect in January. The deadline for reaching a comprehensive agreement is July 20th, which is fast approaching. There are a lot of complex issues to overcome. The parties are still fairly far apart on a number of issues. It's possible that the agreement could be extended for a number of months after July 20th. And obviously, I think the vast majority of people hope that there will be a peaceful diplomatic resolution to one of the world's greatest international security challenges. But it's also possible that diplomacy could fail. And I think that it's imperative that we have a conversation, a national conversation, about what the United States and the international community should do. What's Plan B in the event that diplomacy fails? It's not obvious what Plan B is or should be. The resolution that they will be debating is resolved. Here, let me get the exact wording. Resolved that the United States should use military force against Iran's nuclear program if diplomacy fails. Affirming that resolution, that is supporting that proposition, is the University of Michigan, right over here, actually. Kyle Deming, the guy with the beard, and Alex Pappas from the University of Michigan, and they are coached by Colin Kahl. Aaron, where are you? Back there. Negating the resolution, so opposing the proposition, is Georgetown University, the two Andrews, Andrew Arsht and Andrew Markov, and they are coached by Jonathan Paul. Jonathan Paul.
The question of whether the United States should use military force against Iran's nuclear program if diplomacy fails is both timely and highly relevant. Significance is in part due to the disastrous consequences that a nuclear-armed Iran augurs for the Middle East and for the globe. While it's clear that a successful diplomatic option is preferable, the failure of diplomacy raises two choices: acquiesce to a nuclear-armed Iran, or take action to avert otherwise disastrous regional and global consequences. Understanding Iran's motivations for nuclear acquisition and clearly outlining its intentions is a precursor to understanding the costs of nuclear proliferation and devising solutions in response. According to Matthew Krainig, Associate Professor of IR at Georgetown, the Iranian government as a whole, and Supreme Leader Khomeini in particular, have overseen a vast buildup in nuclear infrastructure. This has occurred in spite of widespread international condemnation and its associated costs. The Iranian leadership has clearly calculated that the benefits of deterring a foreign attack and becoming the most dominant state in the Middle East overwhelm the costs of international hostility. Acquisition would yield benefits in terms of prestige, increasing the likelihood of the regime retaining its grip on power. These justifications make the pursuit of nuclear weapons justifiable from the perspective of those governing Iran. Upon the failure of diplomacy, Iran could dash to a nuclear weapons breakout capability in just 2 to 12 months. While the risks of military action are considerable, the consequences of diplomatic action are too grave to bear. As such, the United States should conduct surgical strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities following the failure of diplomatic negotiations.
Our thesis is quite straightforward, namely that military action in the Middle East against Iran is exactly the wrong way to preserve peace in the region going forward. There are 3 main reasons. First, a strike would not end the Iranian nuclear program. Quite the opposite. An American strike would exacerbate the risk that Iran crosses the nuclear threshold going forward. Second, an American strike is the most likely catalyst for renewed conventional violence across the region and continued escalation. And third, Iran's nuclear program, even in the absence of diplomacy, is not quite as dangerous as our opponents claim. In fact, Iran's leaders are rational, Israel is unlikely to start a war over the issue at the present time, and the US can use containment methods, many already in place, to prevent escalatory instability. A strike would not guarantee an end to Iran's nuclear ambitions. Iran has multiple declared facilities and has acquired a large reservoir of nuclear knowledge. it has also shown a willingness to spend enormous resources on nuclear science. A strike, as Dr. Kahl himself writes, would lead Iran to distance itself from the IAEA and perhaps to pull out of the NPT. This would make future multilateral pressure on Iran impossible. It would also undermine the international inspection regime that has been so valuable in keeping track of Iran's progress to date. It's where they get their data. And it would make Iran's nuclear program opaque, fueling even greater anxiety among its regional allies and foes.
The position advanced by the negative drastically underestimates the risk of a nuclear-armed Iran and is akin to playing Russian roulette with the Middle East and with the globe. The negative holds out hope that the current strategies of diplomacy, of containment, and of the sanctions regime may work, but ignores that the resolution of today's debate calls for what we should do when those solutions have failed. The negative simply asks that you acquiesce to a nuclear Iran in this world. It is our belief that this position is both misguided and dangerous. Given this sobering reality, we contend that a limited surgical strike is the best available option. First, I will address their arguments about the ineffectiveness of a strike. First, they speak to the value of international inspectors, yet that ignores that those inspectors are no longer useful in a world in which Iran has crossed substantial red lines of 90% uranium enrichment or already kicked out those inspectors, which is the contingency in which we would strike to begin with. The second point is that those inspectors, according to many expert accounts, are retained solely to create the perception of a peaceful nuclear program, and little suggests that that incentive would meaningfully change after the United States has struck. Yes, Iran has a substantial reservoir of nuclear knowledge, but a military strike would certainly induce caution on behalf of those in the Iranian nuclear establishment and possibly deter them altogether. Now, the claim that Iran would redouble its nuclear efforts is wrong. It assumes that Iran isn't already committed to building a nuclear weapon, which was the point that Kyle was getting to in Cross-Ex. It also assumes that we simply couldn't mow the grass later and attack once again to prevent Iran from further nuclear proliferation.
Michigan's core argument rests on a major logical contradiction, and it undermines the entire efficacy of their proposal. They argue that Iran is irrational enough to give away a nuclear weapon, one of the hallmarks of their regime's legitimacy, to a terrorist group, and irrational enough to risk retaliation from Israel by ramping up its bellicose foreign policy. They also argue that Iran, in a bid to protect its simple self-interest, would not risk a regional war. This is a clear contradiction. We believe, by contrast, that Iran is fundamentally a rational actor. Reformists like Rouhani and Zarif have breathing room to make changes, and the survival and legitimacy of the regime comes before all else. The only thing that could drive Iran to simultaneously intensify its nuclear program and become more bellicose in the region would be striking at the very heart of the legitimacy of the Islamic Republic.
Thanks to the debaters for a lively and spirited exchange, which actually I think captures a lot of the debate that has been raging for years now, really, about whether if all other measures fail to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, the military option should be employed or not. Let me just mention, I think, a handful of issues that I think the debate captured pretty well that reflects the way in which this issue is debated in Washington. I mean, obviously, there's this question of whether Iran is pursuing nuclear weapons at all. Of course, the Iranians claim that they're not. But then there's an open question of if they're not, why have they spent $100 billion to build an infrastructure that looks like it's completely inappropriate for a civilian nuclear program, but quite adequate for a military program? If they're pursuing these capabilities, there's the question of why. Is Iran a kind of reasonable, rational status quo state, albeit one that supports militancy and subversion and terrorism as a means of foreign policy? Or are they irrational, or at the very least an offensively minded, expansionist, revolutionary state? How you answer that question fundamentally determines, in part, how dangerous you think a nuclear-armed Iran would be. And frankly, very smart people about Iran don't agree about which of those are. Are they a defensive status quo state that seeks nuclear capabilities for deterrence because they fear us or fear the Israelis, or do they seek it for prestige and influence and other issues?